What's up, you guys? Rex here. And as always, I'm going to share with you something interesting I learned in a week of medical school. So this past week, we covered the male and female reproductive systems, and I want to talk about some of the incredibly complicated and interesting regulation in the female reproductive system that we don't remotely fully understand yet. So starting off, we probably all know that generally the female reproductive system is going to be way more complicated than the male reproductive system. But starting off, I want to just talk about what is called the hypothalamus pituitary gonad axis. And so it's a classic negative feedback loop of where the hypothalamus in the brain produces something called GnRH, which is telling the pituitary gland, which comes just off the brain, to release both FSH and LH, which are two hormones that then go down to either the ovaries or the testis and tell them to carry out their function. And as a part of that is to release testosterone or estrogen, and then that circles back and shuts off the release of GnRH. What's really interesting is the neurons that release GnRH don't have receptors for either testosterone or estrogen. Instead, there are some additional neurons called kisspeptide neurons thrown into the mix that they have receptors for both estrogen and testosterone. So in males, it's very simple. When these kisspeptide neurons see testosterone, they shut off the GnRH and it stops the cycle until there's not any testosterone anymore, and then that releases the inhibition, and then the GnRH comes again, and then the FSH and the LH, and then the testosterone is produced again, and it continues the cycle, shuts it off, on, in just a nice pulsatile, simple manner. Obviously, female regulation is much more complicated, where instead of just a 24-hour cycle, they're on like a 28-day cycle. And so part of what makes this really interesting and complex that we learned about is there's also a separate set of kisspeptide neurons. And so these can respond to a lot more than just estrogen and progesterone. They can respond to everything from stress hormones, maybe, to leptin, to perhaps responding to the environment, all kinds of different things that are impacting this. So what was really interesting that our professor mentioned is the fact that leptin is something that is impacting these kisspeptide neurons. And leptin is directly related to how much adipose tissue you have. And essentially it's the hormone that tells you you're full. And you can make really fat rats by removing their leptin receptors, and they just eat and eat and eat. And so there's sort of a correlation between rising obesity in America and the age at which girls get their first period. And it might be correlated because of more leptin in the bloodstream that then tells these kisspeptide neurons in some way to change the axis so that girls start having their first period. And so that was a very interesting correlation of just relating to this complexity. Another interesting example of how these kisspeptide neurons might work is that when a woman is nursing, often she no longer can get pregnant. It's thought that potentially nursing, which is very much related to the release of oxytocin from the pituitary gland, and so that might have some correlation to these kisspeptide neurons in some way, that it also shuts off the GnRH production, and that therefore the woman isn't able to get pregnant while she's nursing. Another cool example of the kisspeptide neurons is just what actually starts ovulation. So typically when there is estrogen and progesterone present, these kisspeptide neurons shut off GnRH production, which is stopping the production of FSH and LH, and it stops the ovaries from being stimulated by those two hormones. But what actually triggers ovulation is actually a spike in estrogen without any progesterone, and this might act on a different set of kisspeptide neurons, which instead of shutting off GnRH, actually trigger GnRH to be released, which causes a huge surge in LH in particular, which is the actual trigger of ovulation. But perhaps what was the most just interesting thing in general learning about these kisspeptide neurons was how many maybes that were thrown around in this lecture. There are a lot of different hormones and peptides and stuff produced by the placenta or the ovaries that we just sort of threw a maybe behind in our lecture of maybe they do this, maybe they don't do this. So there's definitely a ton of stuff to learn about the human female reproductive system. And it's interesting because it is something that is really truly unique, not just vastly different from males, but also unique among all mammals. And something that was crazy that I've lived this long and didn't know is that humans are one of only 3 mammals that go through menopause. The other 2 are pilot whales and orcas, which never would have guessed that those are the other 2. And so it's interesting that pilot whales and orcas have sort of a matriarchal society where like a grandmother is in charge of a pod. And so it's theorized that there is an evolutionary advantage that for the female whales, once they reached a certain age, it was better for them to stop having children so they can focus on being this like grandmother leader figure. And so that might be tying into how humans evolved to go through menopause. It might just be the fact that humans have an interesting reproductive strategy where female humans are born with like 10 to 20 million eggs, and throughout their life, the vast majority of them just die off. And so there's only about 400 or 500 eggs that are actually successfully ovulated, that survive long enough to be ovulated. And there's a theory that that was just sort of a evolutionary adaptation to discourage women from having children as much, because it is such a heavy investment in time, resources, and energy to not only be pregnant and give birth, but also to raise an infant and a toddler and nurse a child. And there is so much that goes into it that it is very difficult for a woman to have too many kids and have those kids survive successfully and reproduce on their own. So it might just be a result of where the primary evolutionary goal was to decrease the amount of children by making eggs sort of really bad at dividing and die very often. So as a result of that, eggs eventually die off entirely and there are no more eggs, and so therefore a woman goes through menopause. That might be the reason. And I want to end with just one more really cool fun fact. And so perhaps you've heard about how there are like a million sperm that enter the female reproductive tract, and it's sort of like survival of the fittest. Only one sperm can get to the egg, and then the egg is also like putting up barriers and making it really hard for the sperm to get there. Actually, the egg is in some way trying to attract sperm, but it's doing a specific type of chemoattraction based on the MHC, or major histocompatibility complex, of the sperm. And so MHC is basically sort of a tag on all of our cells that is unique to us, which says human or not human. And so it's a big part of our immune system, and it's also the reason why organ donation gets rejected sometime, because the MHC doesn't line up. And there are a lot of interesting theories and hypotheses that I haven't seen a ton of strong evidence for, related to do humans produce pheromones so that we can match up on MHC. And sort of the evolutionary goal is to have a different MHC than your own so that there's more genetic diversity. And so there's a potential hypothesis out there that a big part of the fact that there are 30 to 40% of infertility cases that are completely unexplained, that some of these may be a result of too close of an MHC complex, or just not the right MHC complex that the egg is looking for in what would be the potential father's sperm. And so it's just never attracting a sperm and never actually successfully conceiving a child, because the sperm's never meeting the egg because it's not attracting the egg. And so that's a very interesting thing of there's some genetic stuff going on that we are totally unaware of that may be factoring into sort of mate selection, which would be a very lame term of talking about like who people marry and fall in love with. But yeah, that's just adding to the ever increasing complexity of the female reproductive system as we learn more and more about it. So if you want to learn more of these cool things as I learned them in my journey in medical school, make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, I'd love to hear about them all down below. As always, like the video if you like the video, dislike the video if you dislike the video. Until next time, don't be ordinary, go be great.